when Peter invited me to give the keynote speech, I put a lot of thought into what to talk about. As you know, I'm here every year and I'm talking most of the time. So simply rehashing my research seemed pointless and really not the point of a keynote speech. So then I considered other topics such as why we love 19th century baseball. John Thorne calls it our favorite decade, our favorite century, and he's right. But every time I tried to come up with something, it descended into navel gazing, and I did not want to do that. But then I found an article on NBCnews.com by David K. Lee and Jesse Kirch. I don't know anything about either of them. The title was Baseball was largely unchanged for more than a century. Now MLB is trying to shake things up. So it's talking about the recent rule changes over the last few years. The article is not a good one. I am not suggesting you go track it down. Its greatest virtue is that it does not seem to have been written by AI. I think it was really written by real people, but it follows the template of there's a lot of mediocre modern journalism where the writer decides what he wants to say, then he goes out and finds somebody that he can say is an expert who will tell him what he wants to say and give a supporting quote. And I want to read that supporting quote to you. Rule changes were traditionally made because there's a problem that needs addressing. So far, so good. In baseball, it had to do with what was happening inside the lines of the field, said Peter Stolpe, who teaches sports business at the University of Oregon's Warsaw Sports Business Center. But what's new, what feels interesting, is that all these rule changes are not necessarily to address a question of the product on the field. The questions being addressed here are about the game in the stands and on TV. There, these rule changes equal business solutions. It wasn't that way historically. I'm stumped. I have no idea what he's going on about. The claim that rule changes were not business decisions is absurd on its face. Baseball has been a business since at least the 1870s. If you're business putting on exhibitions that you're drawing and paying audiences, any decision you make is a business decision. So he's making, I'm also stumped why a sports business professor makes you an expert on the evolution of the game, but that's another subject. He is claiming that the current spate of rule changes are qualitatively different from rule changes of the past. And that's the question that I want to talk about. I'm a firm believer that understanding history can and should inform how we understand modern events. And as Peter pointed out, I wrote a book on how the rules have evolved. It was published in 2019, which means that it was before most of these rule changes. And so how do the rule changes since then fit in? In the book, I identified 3 categories of problems that most, though not all, rule changes attempt to solve. The first category is pace of play or length of game. They're not quite the same thing, but they're closely related. The second is that scoring is too high or more often too low. So we want to adjust, ratchet scoring one way or the other. And the third category is that the umpire is unable to do his job, and so we need to make things a little easier for him. And of these, pace of play has been the issue since the earliest days. Now, in my written part, I have a talk about Johann Christoph Friedrich Gutsmuth and his 1876 book and the drop third strike, but Peter stole my thunder on that. He already went over that, so I'm not going to go into it at length, skip over that part. But the point of the rule was, here the pitcher's tossing the ball up, and I'm the batter, and I am hopelessly inept. and I cannot hit that thing to save my life. Nobody wants to stand around and watch that. Boring. That's why you say after three attempts, the ball's in play, get the game moving. It's a pace of play rule. It's also, I believe, the earliest identifiable change in the rules. Pace of play. Pace of play also gave us the called strike and the base on balls. The Goodsmith describes the swinging strike, but the called strike came later. In the early 1880s, pitchers were throwing harder. They were often favoring velocity over control. And at the same time, batters were letting hittable pitches go by in the quest for some sort of tactical advantage. So games were taking longer. They were running over 3 hours. There were complaints. It made a worse experience both for the players, and at this point, we're starting to have spectators, and some of them are paying for the privilege. So something had to be done. The called strike was on the books since 1858, but it wasn't enforced till years later. The base on balls was added for 1864. And these were truly radical changes. This is where we get the duel between the pitcher and the batter, which today is at the heart of the game. And that was a later addition, and it was denounced at the time. People hated it. That is not baseball. It took years, about a decade, but they were eventually fully accepted. And then we have to work out the implications of this. And we are still working out the implications of this. It's all about the duel between the pitcher and the batter. Through the later 19th and first half of the 20th century, the canonical time for a game was 2 hours. You might let that sink in. You go to the ballpark, you expect to be there for 2 hours. That's also, not coincidentally, how long you expect to be there if you go to the theater for a play or a concert. 2 hours is the norm for an entertainment. Then, over the course of the 20th century, the time of game began creeping up. And fortunately, box scores record the time of game. So, this is entirely measurable. By 1980, the average game was 2.5 hours. By 2017, it was over 3 hours. Various explanations have been offered for why. The one that I favor is that because pitchers were throwing harder and faster and fast more often, they required recovery time. You got to take a quick break between pitches, and if you do a quick break between every pitch, that adds up. Also, the faster, harder pitching results in pitching changes. And individually, any one pitcher change is not that big a deal, but it's not a mid-inning pitcher change is not the most attractive part of the game. And that adds up. So we end up with, in the modern rule changes, a couple attempts. There are restrictions on pitcher changes. You have to face at least 3 batters. But the most dramatic rule change is the pitch clock. Or is it? And when I say, or is it, I'm asking, is it recent? Not, is it dramatic? The pitch clock is a direct response to the length of the game, a very successful response also, but it's not a new idea. A version of the pitch clock rule has been on the rule book since 1901. You can look it up. It directed the umpire to call a ball should the pitcher take more than 20 seconds to deliver a pitch. Now, why is this a deeply obscure piece of baseball history? Because it was never enforced. I do not know of a single instance of the umpire calling a ball based on that rule, except you'll sometimes get where the pitcher's throwing a snit and he just refuses. And so the umpire might use that rule as a lever to get him to get the game going again. But just in the ordinary course of play, the pitcher is dithering is never enforced. In 1960, Bill Veeck attempted to revive the idea by putting a pitch clock on the scoreboard, which he called a pitchometer. And his idea was that the crowd would be watching the clock on the scoreboard and be counting it down, 5, 4, 3, and this would be really exciting. Never. He did put it on the scoreboard, but nothing came of it. Then, this is the part that I find most confounding. In 2006, so this is recent memory for most of us, the time limit was changed from 20 seconds to 12 seconds. And then they still never enforced it. Why change the rule that you have never enforced and then continue to not enforce it? So the modern pitch clock of just the last couple of years is different in that MLB is serious about it. Not that it's a new idea, that enforcing it is a new idea. Why wasn't baseball serious about it in 1901? This brings us, I gave you 3 categories of rule changes. The third one was easing the task of the umpire. And I know we collectively don't have a lot of sympathy for umpires, but that is a tough job, and it was an even tougher job back then because there was only one of them, usually. Multiple umpires were not normal till much later, well into the 20th century. So if you imagine a 1901 umpire being asked to hold a stopwatch, how is he going to be standing here watching a stopwatch, which means he's not watching what the players are doing? Or is he supposed to be there back there, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi? Making the rule with no way for it to be enforced was pointless, but that didn't stop them from doing it. In a rational world, they would have thought about it in 1902 and said, well, that didn't work out, so let's just take it off. But what actually happened is they just left it in the rule book forever. Institutional inertia. This should not be too surprising because there is an established pattern of moribund rules that stay in the rule book long past when they're actually used. And if you don't believe me, pull up the 2025 rule book and look at that beautiful drawing of a batter showing the strike zone. It bears no resemblance to what umpires actually call, and it bears no resemblance to what automatic balls and strikes in spring training just a month ago was using. I find this fascinating. We have a rule that is simply not how they do it, and they don't change it. So they actually have conflicting rules now. But we all know what the real strike zone is, and that's why they don't have to do it. Just like they all knew that there was no real pitch clock, so they didn't have to change it. Returning to the topic of easing the umpire's burden, video review. I doubt that umpires appreciate the gesture, but the video review exists to ease the burden. And it is because their job is to get the call right. And video review helps them get the call right, even if they wish it didn't. Video replay technology came in, I remember it from the 70s when I was a kid. And it was kind of an amazing thing, new thing there that you could go see that play at first. But you only had like 2 camera angles, pretty low resolution, maybe some slow motion, but not very slow. It was pretty bad. And I remember that the received wisdom that I grew up in California. You know, Vin Scully would say, oh, yeah, umpires almost always get it right. Then the technology got better. Now we have many, many camera angles. We have very excellent high resolution. We have slow motion that can go frame by frame. And you can really see if the umpire got it right or not. And it turned out that, yeah, they usually get it right, but they get it wrong a lot more often than we thought back in the day. And at that point, video review is inevitable. It is unsustainable to not use it when everybody knows that the umpire got it wrong. And it's also notable that this is not just a baseball thing. It's true across sports. So video review can finally explain to us Americans maybe what a leg before wicket in cricket is, because they can actually show where that ball was going to go. And in baseball, it can tell us that Jim Joyce blew the call and Armando Galarraga should have had a perfect game. Everyone in here, except my son because he's too young and a young punk, we all know that play. We all know how it played out. Once you have that, how can you not use the technology that you have available? But it does help the umpire in that they get the call right. Jim Joyce was heartbroken afterwards because he knew that he had gotten it wrong. And to his credit, he admitted it and he apologized and seemed, by all of the signs, to be sincerely apologetic. But Armando Galarraga still is not credited with a perfect game. Yeah. I also mentioned when I was saying categories of rule changes, the second one I said was to adjust scoring levels. The great era of constant rule changes from every year was the 1880s, and scoring levels was the driving force. So pitching was getting better, fielding was getting better. And so that means that scoring was going down. And the National League and the American Association, they were worried about this. If scoring gets down to 0, you got soccer games. And none of us want that. So there was a series of rule changes to try to increase scoring. This is why the number of balls for a walk came down from 9 to 4. It almost went down to 3. Serious discussions, but they never pulled the trigger. That is why the pitcher was moved back. That is why the pitching delivery was restricted. The modern pitching delivery dates from 1887, and it was all about this. So that's where we actually get something new today, or at least newish, because modern scoring levels are actually well within historical range. I mean, you'll see articles saying, scoring was down in 2024 and we must do something. But that's because that's written by people who think that 5 years ago was a long time in baseball history. In the broad scope of baseball history, scoring levels are within the normal range. What is different is how runs are scored. The great long-term trend in baseball going back to the end of the dead ball era was home run rates go up when young George Ruth figured out that hitting a home run was a good way to win a game. And a few people noticed right away, and more and more people have noticed since then. And so for the last 100 years, home run rates have been going largely up. Pitchers responded. If this guy's trying to hit a home run and we don't want that to happen, the best way to keep him from hitting the home run is to make sure that he misses the ball. So pitchers were pitching specifically trying to strike the guy out. Strikeout rates have been going, by and large, up for the last 100 years. if you hang out with groups who hate sabermetrics, they'll say us the stat head guys are ruining the game, and that's why pitchers are doing this. But it's nothing new. This is three true outcomes baseball: home runs, strikeouts, and bases on balls. Is not new. We are at the late stages of a century-long trend, such that nobody can escape noticing it if you're paying any attention at all. So, rule changes are made to solve a problem. Is this a problem? Is three true outcomes baseball a bad thing? You love it when your guy hits a home run. That's exciting. But there is a widespread, not universal by any means, but widespread opinion that this makes for boring baseball. And Major League Baseball seems to have at least tentatively agreed with this. So this is new. Through most of baseball history, baseball cared how many runs were scored, but they didn't care how they happened. And now, to some extent, we do care how they happen. So we have a new category of problems to be solved. So that actually is something new. The rule responses have been interesting and often kind of brilliant and subtle. The expanded base size. Bases used to be 12 inches square, now they're 15 inches square. Well, what's the point of that? The point of that is that now a base runner trying to steal the next base has 6 inches less to do it. And we've watched those replays. The batter coming in for the slide, and the second baseman just barely gets him in time. If he had to go 6 inches fewer, he would have been safe. So now you can steal your bases a little bit more freely. The bulk rule has been adjusted. The people who like to complain, but I don't believe for an instant that any of them know what a bulk is. How many of us know what a bulk is? So complaining that they've changed the bulk rule, saying they've changed a rule that I don't understand to a new rule that I don't understand, and that's bad. I am impressed by professional umpires in that they actually do seem to know what a bulk is. Often the pitcher and the manager don't, but the umpires are actually really good at that. The shift. Remember the shift? So now we restrict the shift. And there were a lot of complaints, even from kind of sane, reasonable people. We're a little queasy about that. But in reality, the infield today looks just like the infield of 10 years ago. It may not look like the infield of 5 years ago, but it does look like the infield of 10 years ago. And if you didn't know that there was a rule restricting where the shortstop and the second baseman could position themselves, if you didn't know that rule was on the books because you saw it on the news, you would never notice it. I like rule changes that you would never notice. Those are good. Here's one. This is a subtle rule change and completely radical. Restricting the roster. So the rules have always distinguished who is a pitcher and who is not a pitcher. You have to, because there are rules about what the pitcher can do, so you have to know who the pitcher is. And who is that guy a pitcher or not a pitcher depends on where he is. If the guy who has a P next to his name in the lineup is in the infield somewhere, he's just an infielder. The rules are very specific about where he is and what he does, and suddenly he's a pitcher, and there are special rules, and if he breaks those rules, it's a balk, which none of us know what that is. But we know it's a balk because the umpire told us. So the rules have always distinguished who is a pitcher, and by implication, who is not a pitcher. But this was only when he was actually on the field. If the guy sitting on the bench, is he a pitcher? How do you know? Maybe the manager is going to do something fancy and put him in right field for one at bat. Then he's a right fielder. So if he's sitting on the bench, you don't know what position he is. Now you do. There was a rule just instituted, I want to say within the last 2 years, limiting a major league roster to no more than 13 pitchers. We'll get to why, but first, when I was a kid, I mentioned before, I grew up watching Vin Scully announcing for the Dodgers. It's been downhill ever since. And we had these discussions. How many pitchers should the Dodgers carry this year? And the question was, will it be 9 or will it be 10? And the answer was 10. But the 10th guy was Bobby Castillo. And we really hoped to never see him on the mound because he was not good. And we assumed that the only reason that the Dodgers carried him on their roster was because he was friends with Fernando Valenzuela and they wanted to keep Fernando happy, which was pretty high priority in fairness. Since then, the bullpen has been expanding. So now come out of spring training with 13 pitchers is totally normal, which means that how many utility guys are you? How many bench players do you now have? Very few. Why are we doing this? Why do they keep on having more pitchers? Because pitchers are throwing fewer innings. Nowadays, if your starter gives you 4 good innings, you're okay with that. You wish he gave you 5, but you're okay with 4. And then you're going to have a guy come in, throw 1 inning. Then you have another guy throw 1 inning and so on. So you need a big bullpen for that. So the new rule, you can only have 13 pitchers, is because before long we're going to have 14, 15, how far can this go? And Major League Baseball wants to pull back on how free teams are to have the guy come in, throw as hard as he can for 3 outs, and then go sit down for 2 days. They want to make that harder to do so that you have to ease up a little bit, which will allow more balls in play, which will allow more non-3 true outcomes play. This is radical because now you have to define who is a pitcher, even when he's sitting on the bench. And we all know that you have it's the 14th inning and you bring the center fielder in to pitch for an inning. And they didn't want to prohibit that. So now we also have rules about when you can have a non-pitcher pitch. Isn't that complicated? If you haven't heard about this, it's because it doesn't get talked about much because it doesn't change what the game looks like. So very few people get too upset about it. It doesn't get written about a whole lot. And frankly, I think the jury is out. Does this idea work? I'm not convinced, but maybe. But as conceptually, I find it fascinating because it is a radical conceptual change. So is Peter Stolpe right? He was the sports business guy quoted in that article. Was he right? I think he was right a little bit. I am still mystified by his distinction between a rule change made due to the play on the field and a rule change made as a business decision. I have no idea what he means by that. But he is right that there's something new here. Baseball cares about something that it did not used to care about. It has instituted some very interesting and genuinely novel rules in response. So I'm going to close out. How am I doing on time? Yeah. Oh, you were so entranced you didn't have even like. Yeah. Okay. As it happens, I share the small ball aesthetic. I recognize that this is an aesthetic. I'm not saying that small ball is a better way to win the ball game. And I do want my team to win the ball game, though I'm an Orioles fan, so I've not had much luck there. But just in terms of what do I enjoy watching a baseball game, balls in play, you know, a ground ball through the infield, some stolen bases. I love that stuff. I love station to station ball just as a spectator. Since my book came out, I've often been asked, what is the one rule change I would propose? If I were God, if I were commissioner, what would I do? I'm a little slow sometimes. I should have anticipated that question when I wrote the book, and I didn't. So the first time I got asked, I was caught flat-footed and I made something up. And since then, my answers changed, but I have settled in. If I were God and or commissioner, the rule change that I would make, fielding gloves. Infielders have been wearing gloves and mitts since the mid-1880s. At first, only a few did this. The idea caught on. It took about a decade. By the middle of the 1890s, almost everybody was wearing a glove. Bid McPhee was inducted to the Hall in 2000. And part of the reason I am convinced that a big part of the reason he got elected was his story. You got to have a story. And his story was that he was the last guy to not use a glove, which might even be true. I'm not sure. He certainly was a late one. So you have a decade where fielders are starting to wear gloves. There's always pushback against something like that. In 1895, the National League had a serious proposal to ban gloves and mitts to all fielders except the catcher and the first baseman. This was an idea behind its time. I think if the idea had been proposed maybe 5 years earlier, it might have passed. Of course, 5 years earlier was 1890, and they were kind of caught up in other things with the Players' League war, so they weren't putzing around with the rules at that point. But by 1895, when everybody's doing it, everybody except Bid McPhee is doing it, there's no constituency among the players pushing to ban gloves. They didn't want to ban gloves. And most of the owners went along with what the players wanted because, if nothing else, you don't want your shortstop injured because his fingers got jammed. So the idea mostly died, mostly. What they did instead was they put regulations in place on the size of the gloves. That has been true ever since. To this day, one of those pretty pictures in the rules is a picture of an outfielder's glove with dimensions to showing the maximum dimensions. The maximum dimensions allowed are generous and always have been. They've changed over the years, but they've changed to be more generous. I can imagine an outfielder today might be tempted by a bigger glove, an illegally large glove. An infielder wouldn't. Infield gloves are restricted by the practical mechanics of turning a play. If you're a shortstop, you can't be fishing around inside your huge glove to find the ball, which is why infield gloves are smaller. So while the size of gloves is and always has been regulated, it's largely a moot point. They're not regulated really smaller enough to make any difference. I believe that the 1895 discussion was the last critical turning point in baseball, where if they had done that rule differently, baseball today would be really different than how it is. And we just imagine, I know there are a lot of vintage players here. Imagine that's how Major League Baseball was played. One thing I'll tell you is a sharply hit ground ball would be a much better strategy. Now, I am not, despite what my son and Eric think, I am not a sociopath. even in my, if I were God and or commissioner modes, dreams, visions, I recognize that there are legitimate safety reasons. Again, you don't want your shortstop to lose a month of play because he jammed a finger because he was fielding barehanded. That, if he comes in and charges in and picks up the ball barehanded, the announcer says, that's dangerous to do. You shouldn't do that. Watch some cricket. But so my semi-serious suggestion, if I could institute a rule change, is yes, everybody would be allowed to wear a glove. They'd have to be dead ball era gloves, Ty Cobb gloves. All right. So again, a sharply hit ground ball was a perfectly reasonable thing to aspire to back then. Hit them where they ain't. Well, your ranges are going to be a lot smaller. It's a lot easier to hit in the holes if the holes are bigger. I call this my semi-serious suggestion. Because of course it's never going to happen. Despite what my son Roger and Eric think, I'm also not an idiot. It's never going to happen. But so that's why it's semi-serious, but it's serious because I actually think it's a good idea. Feel free to disagree. There would still be great plays made, but they'd be closer to where the guy started. Bigger holes, but there's still that range where the shortstop can make that great diving play and sitting on his butt, throw the ball to first base. All right, that's a good play. Spectator-wise, I love that play. They would still happen. Yeah. So I just want to say that obviously that that's never going to happen. I just think that's a failure of imagination. So there you go.
Give you something.
Okay.
Not your average thinking. Richard, I want to thank you and our audience here. Would like to present you with a signed baseball for the 2025 Fred with all those signatures squeezed on there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I saw it in the library and I almost went up to sign it to add my name.
Thank you. We were trying to hide it from you. Okay.